It looks like Hollywood is falling apart, doesn't it? The writers are on strike, the actors are on strike. DC has had 3 box office bombs in a row in what was supposed to be a safe category of films. Marvel's Phase 4 has been commercially lackluster. The middle budget movie has all but collapsed, leading to an influx of low budget horror films or 9-figure budget blockbusters with almost nothing in between. But on the other hand, there are a lot of 9-figure budget films poising themselves as blockbusters. There are more and more higher budget movies being released every year. Of the 54 movies with a budget of over $200 million, all of them were released after the year 2000. 35 of them were released in the 2010s, and 10 of them have been released in the first 3 years of the 2020s. Budgets keep going up. Salaries for top talent keep going up. There is so much content on streamers that keeps getting pumped out that it's difficult to keep up with. So what's going on? Is Hollywood falling apart or not? Let's take a closer look at the separate components, which, hopefully, will lead us to some semblance of an answer. We're going to look at 3 things that are and aren't contributing to the current state of Hollywood and how they impact its future. The first is the issue of originality and genre, the second is budgets, and the third is the strikes. But even before you watch the video, give it some thought. Is Hollywood falling apart? And are these 3 things I mentioned issues? Leave a comment and let me know what you think, and let's see if our thoughts match up. First, we're going to look at the kind of movies that are being made. There are 2 subpoints, originality and genre. I'll answer the questions first. Do I think that a lack of originality and focus on specific genres are indicative of Hollywood falling apart? This has 2 answers, no and yes.
I've heard that it's unwise to seek the counsel of elves, but they will answer both yes and no.
I don't think that the lack of originality is indicative of the industry falling apart, but I do think that over-reliance on specific kinds of movies might be a sign. These 2 are intertwined, and the first leads to the second. Let's tackle originality first. A common complaint about Hollywood is that it's unoriginal. I've never found this to be a particularly compelling complaint or argument. Disney is usually trotted out as an example. People get upset that the company is plundering its animated movies and trotting out live-action versions of them. But be real, when has Disney ever been original? Take a look at Disney movies from the 50s until now. What's a popular, successful Disney movie that's original? Not Alice in Wonderland, Cinderella, The Jungle Book, Peter Pan, Pinocchio, Robin Hood, The Little Mermaid, Hercules, Tarzan, Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Mulan, or Pocahontas. The only movie that really comes to mind immediately is Zootopia. Disney is not famed for their originality, but it's undeniable that Disney has created some wonderful films over the 100 years that they've been in business. Those films were possible thanks to the work of writers hundreds, even thousands of years before now. Judging quality based on originality is shallow. Worse, it's not even a good measure. Being original does not make movie good, nor does being based on a franchise make it bad. In order to survive, Hollywood needs both original films and franchises. Something new and something old, something risky and something safe. But there's a reason that movies are unoriginal. Because of us, the consumers. Consumers usually say they want something original, but when it's time to spend, they go with the prequels, sequels, remakes, and franchises. But it would be a bad idea to fault consumers for this too. After all, it makes sense. Ticket prices are increasing every year, and it could cost more than $100 for a family of 4 to go out to a movie. At my local movie theater, it ranges anywhere from $11 for a morning show to $25 for an IMAX showing. You want to spend money on something that you're sure that you'll enjoy. But part of asking people to take a risk in making movies means that consumers are willing to take a risk in watching them. Looking at the domestic box office numbers from 2022, the first original high-grossing movie is Jordan Peele's Nope at number 14. Numbers 1 through 13 are all sequels, prequels, adaptations, franchise films, or, in the case of Elvis, a biopic. As consumers, we vote with our wallets. To an extent, where the people go, so the studios will go. Creatives, such as writers, actors, and directors, might have movies they want to make. Same with the studio heads. But they're most concerned with the commercial appeal. What sells? They'll spend money on whatever people spend money on. That leads to our second point, over-reliance on specific kinds of films, specifically superhero films. Now, I enjoy superhero films. I've watched every Marvel and DC movie since Iron Man in theaters, and I've sat through marathons that have gone on for more than a day because I enjoy the movies so much. But it's undeniable that superhero movies, which were a huge draw during the latter half of the aughts and through the 2010s, are in decline, almost neatly demarcated by the pandemic. We'll compare Marvel's Phase 3 and Phase 4. Phase 3 lasted from Captain America Civil War in 2016 until Spider-Man Far From Home in 2019. More than half of the 11 films released during that time grossed more than $1 billion, 2 of them exceeding $2 billion. Meanwhile, only one of the 7 Phase 4 films, Spider-Man No Way Home, grossed more than $1 billion. Couple that with the fact that the budgets only increased, while some sequels saw a decline in gross. The most glaring difference is between Black Panther, which made $1.35 billion on a budget of $200 million, and Black Panther Wakanda Forever, which made $859 million on a budget of $250 million. But at least Marvel can say that their movies are making money. DC has had 3 box office bombs in a row: Black Adam, Shazam! Fury of the Gods, and The Flash. They cost a combined $585 million to make and only grossed $790 million at the box office. Compare that to Guardians of the Galaxy 3. Despite making less and costing $80 million more than Guardians of the Galaxy 2 to make, it made $841 million at the box office, a more than $50 million difference compared to the last 3 DC films. The story is the same with Star Wars. Despite every Star Wars movie since 2015, except for Solo, grossing more than $1 billion at the box office, they've each suffered steep declines. The Last Jedi made more than $700 million less than The Force Awakens, while The Rise of Skywalker made $257 million less than The Last Jedi. Rogue One made just a little less than Rise of Skywalker, but was also $200 million cheaper to make. Part of this is just a fall-off effect. Between each film, there's a chance that some people will fall off or just not care. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone sold 120 million copies, Chamber of Secrets sold 77 million, and Prisoner of Azkaban sold even fewer. That's normal. What's not normal is the over-reliance on a single franchise. The MCU, the DCEU, Star Wars, and more. Each franchise is old at this point, anywhere from 10 years for the current DCEU to 46 years for Star Wars to more than 50 years for Bond. The inability to create new franchises could have a deleterious effect on Hollywood. A strike can be resolved in a few months, but changing the fundamental operating procedure of your movie studio, that could take years. Disney has grown massive by relying on Marvel and Star Wars. I think the franchises still have some steam left in them, but it's evident they're closer to running on fumes than anything else. But here's the problem. Despite each movie making less than their predecessors, the movies are still far and away the most popular films being made. They're still the ones filling seats and selling tickets. Some of you are probably thinking, aren't these the same thing? After all, I basically said originality might not matter, but at the same time showed that unoriginal films are declining in revenue. It's a distinction with a difference. At the end of the day, the studios need original and unoriginal content. Something risky and something risk-averse to hedge the risk. If they can't strike a balance, they might be doomed. The studios are caught between a rock and a hard place. They know that budgets are increasing and box office grosses are decreasing on the high end, particularly in 2023. But consumers are used to and expect a certain level of quality. Actors demanding a raise, complex effects, or increased interest rates on the debt necessary to finance a film can drive the budget up. But these films are still making money, and it wouldn't be financially prudent to not make them. So they eat the budget cost and take the decline, because at least the movie is still profitable, albeit less every time. This might be the most pressing question for studios and the one that determines how they survive. They need to find a way to increase the box office, decrease the budget, or spread the risk across more franchises and films. Simply making original films is unlikely to cut it. The films need to be good, or at least worth spending money and time on. This means that while budgets need to decrease on the high end, they should rise in other areas. This leads to our second point, the budgets, which have only continued to grow. It seems as though every other movie that's released is the quote most expensive movie ever made, end quote. If there's one thing that's most likely to cause a collapse in Hollywood, it's the mismatch between budgets and returns. Stephen Follows has some of the best research and writing on the film industry that I've seen, and he estimated that across a sample size of 4,526 movies, at least 50% lost money. Simply looking at the box office gross is not good enough. We need to consider the factors that reduce how much the studio makes, including movie theater share, distribution fees, marketing costs, paying off lenders and financiers, accounting for back-end points, and more. Much like venture capital, though, one successful film pays for dozens of unsuccessful ones. Over the decades, Hollywood has sundered into two camps. One takes the Blumhouse route. They produce cheap movies, often horror movies, with a budget below $10 million that have the potential for a huge box office return based on the low budget. For example, Get Out was made on a budget of $4.5 million, and it made $255 million at the box office. 2018's Halloween cost $10 million, but made $260 million. 2017 Split cost $9 million and made $278 million. And then there's Paranormal Activity. It cost $15,000 to make and made $193 million. The other camp makes big budget movies in the hopes of big box office return. Avatar: The Way of Water cost anywhere between $350 and $450 million, but made $2.32 billion at the box office. Top Gun Maverick cost $170 million and made almost $1.5 billion. Avengers Endgame cost anywhere from $356 to $400 million and cleared close to $2.8 billion. Big risk, big reward. What's missing though is the middle. Movies that cost more than $15 million but less than $100 million, ideally in the $40 to $70 million range. Studios either don't want to take a risk and hope for a big multiple, or take a huge risk and hope for a big payday. In both cases, they're swinging for the fences. The mid-budget film has moved to streaming, where it tends to get lost among the thousands of other titles people scroll by. I think it's a mistake to leave them just treading water there. Knives Out, which was released in 2019, is the perfect example of a mid-budget film done well. It cost $40 million to make, but made $312 million at the box office. A couple of years before it, Murder on the Orient Express, which cost $55 million to make, made $353 million at the box office. The first three John Wick movies ranged in budget from $20 to $75 million and made anywhere from $86 million to $328 million at the box office, despite being rated R. Everything Everywhere All at Once cost between $14 and $25 million and made $141 million at the box office. These 6 movies show that the mid-budget movie is not dead, and that it's perfectly possible to create great movies at a low cost. More importantly for studios, it's possible to create new franchises, something that ties in with point 1. Studios need to realize that they need films of all sorts: low budget, mid-budget, and high budget. This serves 2 purposes. 1. It provides an on-ramp and a slightly railed path for talent. Directors, producers, actors, and more can start on low-budget films and, to an extent, work their way up and prove themselves. Right now, it jumps from low-budget indie movies to high-budget blockbusters with thousands of people involved in them. There needs to be a middle path, and it needs investment from studios. This would also go a long way to helping resolve labor issues by creating more work and opportunities across the board. 2. It provides a testing ground for franchises. In order to create a new franchise, you need to create at least one original film. The high end is dominated by adaptations, films that are based on existing novels or comics. The low end is dominated by horror films, cheap films that can spawn new horror franchises like Terrifier and Insidious. But thrillers, mysteries, dramas, and comedies have their own appeal. They might require more investment for visual effects, large casts, more locations or stars, but that's what it is, an investment. Yes, it implies some risk, but it's a risk worth taking, especially in the short term to ensure longevity. To be sure, not every movie needs a theatrical release, and some movies would probably be better served by streaming, but certainly not to the extent that we've seen. But as big budget movies start making less, we might see a natural uptick in mid-budget films, or at least cheaper films. Budgets have bloated beyond belief and should come down a bit. At least that would lessen the impact of declining sales for blockbusters. Third is the strikes. Do I think that these strikes mean that Hollywood is falling apart? My answer is, shockingly, no. Let's take a look at the background of the strikes before looking at why I don't think it'll lead to a collapse in film and television. On May 2nd, 2023, the Writers Guild of America, which represents 11,500 screenwriters, went on strike over a labor dispute with the AMPTP, or the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, a trade association that's made up of the major movie studios like Paramount, Sony, Universal, and Disney, as well as the major networks like ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC, and more recently, the major streamers like Netflix, Apple TV Plus, and Amazon. SAG-AFTRA, or the Screen Actors Guild, and the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, which represents film actors, TV actors, journalists, and more, began their own strike on July 14, 2023. This was their first strike since 1980, and the first time that the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes coincided since 1960. Both strikes were authorized with overwhelming support. The issue is, as always, focused on healing the mistakes of the past for the present and ensuring a brighter future for those involved. Both unions have an issue with how residuals are handled from streaming. That is to say, writers and actors barely get any. This is partly because of the opaqueness with numbers on the side of companies like Netflix, Disney+, Max, and others. They don't share how many viewers actually watched something, which makes it difficult to calculate how much to pay actors and writers, who have for a long time relied on star power. The second issue both unions agree on is the role of AI. Namely, they don't want to be replaced with it. Writers think that it should only be used to help facilitate research and script ideas, while the actual writing of the script should be left to a human screenwriter. Perhaps more troubling was how the AMPTP wanted to use AI for actors. They wanted the ability to pay actors for a single day of work to capture the likeness of them, and to use that in the future, forever, without any further compensation. Responses from media executives only added fuel to the fire. The most catching was from an anonymous AMPTP executive who said that they should consider dragging the strikes out until people start losing their homes in order to extract a favorable contract. Other issues are unique to either side: larger writers' rooms and more funding for writers for the WGA, and regulations of self-taping for the actors for SAG-AFTRA. The strikes have, obviously, stopped a number of productions, including Avatar 3 and 4, Blade, Deadpool 3, Fantastic Four, Superman Legacy, and dozens more. The strikes are serious, to be sure. The WGA and SAG-AFTRA both have important complaints that the AMPTP needs to address. Without writers and actors, you don't have movies or television. However, the unions and the AMPTP are not necessarily enemies. In fact, it's a symbiotic relationship. One cannot survive without the other. The producers need actors and writers, otherwise they don't have a movie. The actors and writers need to get paid so they can live. A prolonged conflict does not benefit either side, but it is a necessary medicine in order to ensure that each party is on equal footing going forward. Hollywood has gone through many strikes in the past. There were 7 strikes in the 1980s alone. While there was a short-term impact on movies each time, it had a negligible long-term impact on the industry, which has continued to grow over the years except during the pandemic. Entertainment and culture are America's chief exports. People love American movies, though homegrown industries are popping up and taking hold. Hollywood has given America a significant soft power hold on the rest of the world. Media and entertainment is, after all, a $660 billion industry in the United States. I'm doubtful that the unions or the AMPTP are willing to burn all of that to the ground over this dispute. How long it'll last is uncertain, but what is certain is that it'll end and production will resume. The strike showed that there are internal issues to work out. I think these will be resolved mostly because it's in everyone's best interests to do so. I don't think that originality is necessarily an issue, but I do think that the over-reliance on tentpole features like the superhero films is. There needs to be a happy medium between original films that are risky to produce and watch, as well as franchises that are a sure bet for both producers and consumers. Sure, you could have a dud, or you could have the next John Wick. But I think the biggest threat is the lack of theatrical mid-budget releases. Solving this issue would solve several issues at once. It would create more opportunities for creatives such as writers, directors, and actors, as well as all other roles. It would solve the originality issue by virtue of more content being made for theaters. It would help lessen the potential deadweight risk of large box office flops, and it would provide a way to create new franchises that could be reliable moneymakers in the future. Hollywood is by no means safe or out of the woods. I don't think it's falling apart, but I don't think it's on the right path either. There is a lot of work to do.